Hi, welcome to Midnight Sleep Whispers. Here, you can dive into a world of mysterious and chilling horror stories perfect for falling asleep or just unwinding. Get cozy, dim the lights, and let's begin. In early 1896, as frost seized the breath and icy winds from the Yukon ridges tore at the fabric of time, Alaska, gripped by the gold rush, resembled a vast chessboard where people dreamers, adventurers, and loners became pawns, all vying to wrest wealth from the earth. Among them was George Kramer, a prospector weathered by time, a man without a home or roots, yet steadfast in his belief in luck. He wasn't chasing the promises of others' finds. He sought his own gold, that singular spot on the map never revealed in borrowed tales. His path led him further from civilization, across hills and frozen rivers, along animal trails and treacherous crossings, toward a remote valley marked on local maps only as an empty void. Those few who knew of it called it the Silent. Legends swirled around the valley. It was said that even animals avoided venturing there, that the earth hummed in its lowlands at night, and that those who entered never returned or came back changed, broken, silent like the valley itself. The indigenous people cut off conversations when it was mentioned, as if its name were a curse. They spoke of the spirits of the north, guardians of ancient riches, who forgave not those who came with greed. Kramer listened and dismissed it. To him, spirits were mere fabrications of people exhausted by the cold. He trusted only in the weight of gold and the clink of metal. When he first glimpsed the Silent Valley from the ridge, his breath caught not from fear, but from its grandeur. Before him stretched a pristine white plain, pierced by the black lines of dry riverbeds, framed by jagged cliffs that seemed to close over it like the maw of a predator. No smoke, no movement, no sound, no birds in the sky, no tracks in the snow. The silence here was different, not peaceful, but oppressive, as if the earth itself held its breath, watching him. Yet Kramer stepped forward, with a rifle on his shoulder, a pickaxe in hand, a tent on his back, and a map he had drawn himself. He was the first in many years to dare enter this valley, and the last to do so without fee. George Kramer was neither a fool nor a romantic. He didn't believe in prophecies, curses, or campfire tales meant to scare newcomers. Everything he believed in could be weighed, molded into a nugget, and traded for food, warmth, and another chance. He had lived this way for years, chasing rumors and the stories of those who had glimpsed gold but failed to hold on to it. He had seen others burn out in pursuit of a dream, and had himself stood on the edge more than once, but each time he returned with scraps that reminded him there was still a place out there where the earth might yield more. He heard about the Silent Valley, by chance during a slurred, half-drunken conversation in a ramshackle bar by the riverbank. An old man with half-blind eyes, a grimy beard, and hands blackened by mercury spoke of gold in clay fissures, of nuggets the size of a fist that had gone untouched for decades. He spoke with a mix of bitterness and fear, but Kramer latched onto the key point. There was gold there, and it remained unclaimed. No prospector had worked it officially, no one had staked a claim, and no one had returned with a map. For George, this wasn't a warning signet, was an opportunity. He knew the greatest finds always lay beyond the boundary, in places where fear loomed, where no paths were blazed, where risk was inevitable. He had no interest in old claims with depleted soil and empty promises. He sought a spot where everything began anew, where no one else's shovel had dug, where no neighbor's shouts echoed across the slope, where no prying eyes lingered. The Silent Valley was his wager, perhaps his last. But if gold truly lay buried beneath layers of century-old permafrost, if nuggets indeed hid between boulders, undisturbed even by time, then he would be the one to find them. Not for fame, not for stories, but to finally end this endless chase, to wrest one last chance from the cursed earth and prove to himself that all those years on the brink had not been in vain. He didn't go there as an explorer or a guest. He went to take, to survive, and, if luck held, to never again return to a life where gold was merely a dream, not something he could hold in his hand. As soon as George crossed the boundary of the Silent Valley, unmarked by anything save a subtle shift in the terrain and a slightly denser fog. The sky seemed to freeze. No gusts of wind, no movement of clouds. It was as if nature itself held its breath. He didn't immediately notice that the silence was more than just an absence of sound. It was something greater, as if the valley itself erased any noise from its domain. Even his steps through the loose snow sounded muffled, as though dampened by a thick layer of ice. There was no chirp of a bird, no crack of a branch, no distant echo. Everything seemed to sink into an invisible cushion that grew denser the deeper he ventured. He tried to check his compass to fix his direction, but the needle spun helplessly, as if trapped in its own loop. He shook the device, inspected the magnet. Nothing. The instrument was useless, like a child's toy. There was something unsettling about this, not merely a malfunction, but a refusal of reality itself to adhere to familiar laws. The sun hung in the sky strangely, neither rising nor setting. Its light was dim, diffused, as if filtered through clouded glass. Time lost its clarity. No shadows, no sense of direction. Only this sticky silence and the eerie feeling that someone was watching. Not tracking him, watching from within the earth itself, through moss, roots, and the thin layer of snow crust, like an eyelid that could not blink. Each hour blurred into the one before, and he could no longer recall how long he had been walking. The campfire offered scant warmth. Even the smell of smoke seemed hollow, weathered away. Nature, it seemed, had yielded to something else, something that had allowed him to enter but had yet to decide whether it would let him leave. George Kramer had always considered himself a man accustomed to solitude. He had endured harsh winters in isolated cabins, going weeks without hearing a human voice, and this had never troubled him. But the silent valley erased his familiar understanding of loneliness, transforming it into something else, a sticky, drawn-out sensation from which there was no escape, not even within the confines of his own mind. He began keeping a journal on the very first evening, intending to track time and events. But soon, his entries grew increasingly fragmented and disjointed. He could no longer say how many days he had spent in the valley. Morning and evening merged into a murky twilight. Clocks ceased to function, and even the fire seemed to burn with a constant, unchanging brightness. Time became as unsteady as ripples on a frozen swamp. It moved, but led nowhere. At first, he felt only unease. Then came a cold sensation between his shoulder blades while sitting by the campfire, as if someone stood behind him. He would spin around sharply, but there was always only darkness, the forest, and trees bowing their heads. No tracks, no sounds, just an oppressive emptiness. At some point, he caught himself slowly, almost subconsciously, turning to avoid leaving his back exposed. He started writing that it was somewhere nearby. Initially with irony, as if joking with himself, later with marked seriousness. He wrote that he felt a breath, not the wind, but a breath, warm, moist, brushing the back of his neck. Once he heard a faint creak, as if a foot had slid across the snow, not human, but something heavy and soft at once. When he leapt from the tent with his rifle, there was nothing but the tracks of his own steps, or so it seemed to him. On one of the journal's pages, his handwriting changes abruptly, as if penned by a different person, angular, jagged, and halting. The sentences grow shorter, the thoughts more anxious. He was no longer just losing track of the days. He began to fear the nights. But even more, he dreaded the possibility that one night might never end. On the sixth day, Fortuneer, what George Kramer would later suspect, might have been its cruel illusions miled upon him. Under a blazing yet frigid sun, when even the rocks seemed like faded shadows of past warmth, he toiled at the bottom of a dried-up creek. His hands, cracked and scarred, mechanically dug at the earth between boulders when the blade of his pickaxe snagged on something solid. The metal emitted a dull, alien sound, not stone, not ice. He tossed the tool aside, clawed at the ground with his fingers, and pulled it free. A nugget, heavy, warm from his efforts, with smooth edges and jagged rims, the size of his clenched fist. He froze, unable to believe his eyes. Such a find surpassed even his wildest dreams. In his hands, he held a ticket to freedom from cold, loneliness, and risk. A wealth wrested by his own labor. Elation surged through him. and he shouted not from joy, but from a near primal excitement, forgetting that the sky over the valley had long ceased to echo. His voice plunged into the depths of the ravine, as if swallowed by some void, and did not return. At first, he paid no mind, but with each passing second after the discovery, the atmosphere began to shift. The wind, if it had been present, suddenly stilled. The branches of the trees ceased their rustling, and even the moss on the rocks seemed to fall silent. The occasional chirping of birds, which he had rarely noticed, ceased altogether. A silence descended, not the kind he had grown accustomed to, but a dense, ringing quiet, like glass on the verge of shattering. George felt the valley hold its breath, as if it had been asleep, and his shout had served as an alarm. He shoved the nugget into his sack, but his hands trembled, no longer from adrenaline but from something else, from the sense that he had made not just a discovery, but a mistake, that this gold had been waiting to be found, and now, having seen the light again, someone or something had opened its eyes. The night following the discovery was particularly frigid. George, exhausted, yet still exhilarated by his find, drifted into a fitful sleep, clutching the sack of gold beneath his blanket, like a child hugging a toy. Beyond the thin fabric of the tent, occasional gusts of wind rustled faintly, but they sounded unnatural, as if the forest were attempting to speak yet had forgotten how. His sleep was shallow, filled with fragments of memories and snippets of unfamiliar voices, until a sudden crack jolted him awake. At first, he thought a branch had fallen, but then a twig snapped close by, and another, then silence, followed by a scratching, a prolonged scraping sound, as if a nail were being dragged across the tent fabric, slow and deliberate, with purpose. George lunged for his rifle. In that same instant, the entire edge of the tent collapsed with a furious rip. The fabric split apart as if sliced by a knife. A blast of cold hit his face, accompanied by a strange, sweet odor reminiscent of rotting earth and bear hide. He raised the rifle but froze. At the edge of the torn entrance stood two glowing spots, not eyeholes, emitting a pale, steady light, as if someone had lit candles inside a skull. They were high, above human height, motionless like two spotlights in the fog. No sound, no movement. Only that lightened the sense that something immense lurked within it. He aimed, but didn't fire. The entity didn't advance. It watched. When he finally steeled himself to bolt and pull the trigger, everything vanished. The light extinguished as if switched off. He burst outside nothing. Just snow, scattered shreds of fabric, and tracks. There were 8 of them. More precisely, 4 pairs. Deep, heavy, as if imprinted by the bulk of a large beast. In shape, they resembled a bear's, but were too elongated, with claws sunk so deeply into the snow that in some spots the earth peeked through. The paws were arranged asymmetrically, as if the creature moved in multiple directions at once. The tracks led toward the forest, and then stopped. Not continued, simply ceased, as if whatever left them had stopped touching the ground. George stood frozen, breathing heavily. The gold in the sack was gone. It had vanished, but something else remained. The smell, the tracks, and most importantly, the knowledge. He was not alone here. And this someone hadn't just frightened him. It had shown it could take everything, and that this was only the first encounter. By morning, the landscape around the camp looked as though it had been clawed apart from within. The torn tent fluttered in the wind. The campfire had long gone out, and the remnants of his gear lay scattered in disarray as if they had been dragged back and forth, toyed with or inspected for contents. George, coated in frost and a mute dread, slowly scanned his surroundings. His gaze darted about, as if grasping for something familiar, any anchor to the reality he knew, but everything seemed alien, distorted. He knew he had gone to sleep clutching the sack. He had felt its weight, remembered its warm heft against his chest, even heard the clink when he shifted it the previous evening, but now nothing. The sack was gone. Not in the tent, not near the rifle, not under the blanket, not in the provision crate. He searched like a man convinced he had lost something priceless but unable to accept that it had vanished. He turned over every scrap of fabric, dug through the snow around the camp, and even checked places he wouldn't have dared look at under normal circumstances. But the gold was gone. No trace. No scatter on the ground, no torn cloth, no hint of a struggle, only a clean disappearance, as if the nugget had evaporated on its own. The threads of logic began to unravel in his mind. He replayed the moment of discovery, over and over, the weight in his hands, the pulse in his temples from excitement, how he had shouted, how he had stuffed the find into the sack. It all felt too vivid, too real. Or had it seemed that way? Could he not have found the gold? Could it all have been a dream born of exhaustion and solitude? But he felt certain the sack had been real. He remembered it. Could he have imagined it all himself? Yet the disappearance of the nugget was only half the trouble. Far more terrifying was the realization that someone or something was here, that it wasn't just watching, but acting, silently, swiftly, as if it knew his thoughts. George stood in the center of the ruined camp and felt the ground beneath his feet seem to breathe. Not loudly, not threateningly, but alive. The wind no longer felt like wind. The trees no longer like trees. And even his own tracks in the snow raised suspicion. Had he truly left them? Doubt seeped into his mind like icy water into his boots. In this valley, everything looked as it had before, yet nothing was the same. The gold was gone. But most importantly, the certainty that he was alone here had vanished. George began his descent at dawn, as a faint, cold light began to dispel the crimson shadows lurking in the folds of the mountains. He packed up the camp as best his strength allowed and headed toward where, in his memory, an old trail remained, a narrow path winding between stones, leading to an icy creek and then to the cliffs beyond, where the familiar tundra stretched out. But the trail was gone. In its place lay the same landscape as around the camp. Hills, bare trees, gray boulders, all resembling one another as if carved from a single mold. George walked on, trying to mark landmark potholes in the rocks, broken twigs, the tracks of his own boots. Yet, after an hour, he found himself back at his starting point. The tracks had vanished. The trees stood differently. The rock he had used as a guide had shifted not physically, but in his perception. He pulled out his compass. The needle twitched as if in spasms, unable to find either pole. It spun in circles, a mockery of his certainty. The wind surged and then fell still, leaving behind what felt like the echoes of unseen footsteps. George chose a new direction and pressed forward through thick moss and dried riverbeds, refusing to look around, refusing to stop. But after several hours, perhaps minutes, once again stood before the shredded tent. Even the ashes of the old fire felt warm, as if he had never left. Panic didn't strike immediately. First came irritation, then caution, then a silence too profound to be natural. Time began to unravel, growing sluggish. He could no longer tell how many hours had passed. 3, 6, a day? The sun remained fixed at the same level, as if nailed to the sky. Shadows neither lengthened nor moved. Everything froze. He started shouting just to hear a sound. The echo returned in a foreign voice, as if repeating not his cry but his thoughts, only with a distortion, a tremble at the end of each phrase. He darted between the trees, losing control, tearing at the moss, hurling stones, trying to leave marks. But each time, he ended up in the same spot. The sun hung like an eye above the horizon. The wind died away, and the entire valley seemed to breathe in unison with him, not letting him leave, not allowing him to forget that he was now part of it, as if it waited for him to stop resisting, to surrender, to fall silent. And then the real ordeal would begin. The nights grew longer, or at least that's how it seemed. The span between sunset and dawn stretched like viscous tar, ensnaring thoughts, movements, even breaths. Each evening brought the same silence, like a dome settling over Kramer's camp, muffling the world to a taut extreme. He no longer lit fires. The flames offered no warmth, only casting shadows that darted too quickly and restlessly, as if dancing to the rhythm of an alien breath. The entity arrived each time unnoticed. No crack of a branch, no rustle of steps, only the sensation that someone stood behind him until he turned. At first, George felt a gaze sticky, penetrating, as if burrowing into his skull. Then, at the edge of his vision, a movement, a quiver of leaves, a sudden shadow where no light should have been. And then, the first thing he truly saw, a paw. It rested on the edge of his tent, quietly, deliberately, but with weight. Enormous, dry, its skin stretched taut over unnaturally long fingers. The claws didn't jut out, they extended, like thin spines, glowing with a faint gray luminescence. George froze. His heart pounded in his chest, but out of sync as if separate from his body, like a final distress signal. The paw vanished as silently as it had appeared. The next night, he glimpsed the outline of jaws not gaping, but slowly parting. Inside were no ordinary teeth, but thin, sharp, translucent growths, like glass needles glinting in the moonlight. The entity didn't growl. It breathed, but that breath echoed within George, somewhere beneath his ribs, as if the air moved through him, as if his lungs no longer belonged to him. Gradually, he began to understand. This was no hunt. It was a collection. The entity had no interest in his body. It drew closer to take something else. Thoughts, memories, dreams. Each night, he awoke feeling emptier. He sensed he was losing words. Familiar phrases slipped away, images blurred. He stared at his reflection in a bowl of water and no longer recognized his own eyes. They had grown duller, deeper, like those of someone who no longer speaks, only listens. Sometimes he thought it was inside him, sometimes that he was it. The entity no longer hid entirely. It allowed him to see fragments. It reached out, studied, and it caused no physical pain. The pain was different. The silence in his mind when he couldn't recall his mother's name, when he didn't know why he held a stick or why he forgive, there was nothing left to fear. With each night, George Kramer faded not as a man of flesh, but as a personality, as a name. The entity didn't kill. It transformed. And he began to realize that the gold he had unearthed was no gift, it was bait. That everyone who took it surrendered something far more valuable in return. Themselves. The valley was changing. Or he was. More and more often, he heard voices not calling, not threatening, but as if arguing among themselves, interrupting one another, hoarse and damp, like ragged breathing through water. They didn't form words, yet he grasped their meaning. They spoke of him. They called him by name, but not in his own voice. With each day, with every rustle in the branches, with every crack of frozen ground beneath his feet, they drew closer. Sometimes he heard the valley itself call his name. Through the trees, from beneath the earth. In the echo of his own heartbeat, he began to see silhouettes among the trunks. On the slope, in the reflection of his water bowl, faceless shadows, but always with eyes, with that same light, now sickeningly familiar. One day, he awoke to find himself talking to himself in a voice he didn't recognize. Hoarse, foreign, with an accent he had never heard. He held the rifle across his knees, but couldn't recall why. He couldn't say how many days had passed, didn't know if he was awake or dreaming. Everything blurred together. Sometimes he tasted ash in his mouth, other times iron, and he began to laugh. Quietly, restrained, as if someone within him found it all deeply amusing. He tried to bury the journal, but an hour later found it back in his hand smeared with dirt, bearing new entries he didn't recall writing. And on the final pages appeared a handwriting resembling his own, yet slightly distorted, elongated, as if etched with a claw. There was a single word, repeated over and over: stay. George stopped believing he would escape. He knew he had to stay. The valley wanted it. The entity or entities already knew him, and now he knew them. While his flesh remained intact, his mind was cracking at the seams. He began to see his shadow where it shouldn't be, heard footsteps behind him, even when he sat still. And when he opened the journal again to write his final lines, he found the pages already filled, not with text, with symbols, jagged edges, patterns, paws, and his own eyes, staring back from within the paper. One day, in the dim light of dawn that in the silent valley seemed artificial and tinged with something rusty, George saw it more clearly than ever before. The entity no longer hid. It stood among the trees, neither advancing nor retreating, just as a predator might, confident that its prey could no longer flee. Its body was indistinct, its outlines wavering with the air, but its maw, the maw, was distinct, enormous, elongated, jagged, as if torn from the earth. And there, between the rows of crooked teeth, he glimpsed a gleam. It was gold. At first, he thought the light had deceived him, but the shimmer was too bright, too familiar, like a sunbeam caught on a pure nugget. One, then another, then a third. Deep within the maw, golden fragments sparkled, not as if swallowed, but embedded in its flesh. The entity moved, and the metals clinked, as if something within it pulsed like a golden vein, alive, breathing. George froze. In that moment, the pieces fell into place. Everything that had seemed nonsensical began to take shape. He recalled how he had pried the first nugget from the frozen earth, as if tearing something that resisted leaving its depths. He remembered how the ground had cracked under his shout, how the night's silence had shattered, as if someone had been waiting for that sound, waiting to hear that it had been touched. The gold hadn't lain there by chance. It was part of something. Part of a body? Part of the entity? Or part of something greater, older than man, older than the trees, older than the valley itself? He understood now. The nuggets he had taken were not treasures. They were anchors, markers. To remove them was to awaken something. Each touch of the gold was like a strike on a bell. He had roused not just a beast, had disrupted a ritual, broken an order preserved for centuries. And now that order was being restored. George felt not fear within him, but exhaustion. All he had endured, the nights filled with rustles and shadows. It was not a hunt. It was a reclamation. What had come for him did not want to kill. It wanted to reclaim its own. It wanted him to understand. And now he knew. He understood why the compass didn't work, why the trees stood like walls, why the entity hadn't torn him apart but merely observed. He was not in a trap. He was within a ritual circle. And the gold he had taken would not leave the valley while he who touched it remained alive. With effort, tearing at the frozen earth with his fingernails, George dug a hole among the roots of a blackened spruce. He placed the nuggets inside each one, gleaming, as if reluctant to vanish into the dirt. As he laid them back, he felt less like a prospector and more like a thief returning stolen goods. Over the hole, he murmured something akin to a prayer, though he didn't know to whom it was addressed. Perhaps to the forest itself, perhaps to the earth, which had guarded this secret for centuries, perhaps to those whose bones, as he now suspected, had long dissolved in this valley, leaving behind only a silent warning. Hope flickered faintly. If he returned the gold, if he acknowledged his guilt, perhaps he would be released. Perhaps this nightmare would end. He remained by the hole until sunset, waiting. The silence, ever breathing in the valley, remained unchanged. But the night did not forgive. When the sky darkened and the first stars hid behind a veil of clouds, the forest stirred anew, not with wind, not with owls, not with the crack of branches, but with an inner certainty that he was not alone. That something approached. Again. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He only wrote in his journal, on scraps of fabric, even on his own palm stove, remember, to document. The gold had been returned, but it changed nothing. The entity continued to come, now closer. He didn't hear its steps, didn't sense its scent, but he felt it within, in his chest, in his gut, beneath his skin. At first, it was a faint itch, then a pulsing, as if something awoke in his own bones. He realized it was too late. He was marked, not for taking the gold, but for awakening it. He had become a vessel, a conduit between what slumbered beneath the earth and what lay above. Now, with the nuggets returned to the depths, the connection didn't break, it solidified. He was part of the valley, part of the entity, and what came to him at night no longer approached from outside. On the 10th day, George awoke with the sensation that his skin was no longer part of him, but something separating. A thin membrane stretched too tight, unnaturally alive. The itch, once faint, had now turned into a constant burning, as if something beneath the surface writhed, stirred, and grew. He clawed at patches of skin on his forearms, expecting to see blood, but beneath his nails remained only flakes gray, almost ashen, devoid of pain. Not a single drop of blood. His hands began to change shape, not dramatically. Not in a single day, but the joints seemed to swell, and his fingers lengthened, curving slightly outward. He noticed his nails darkening and hardening, as if transforming into claws. At first, he convinced himself it was merely the result of hunger, solitude, and cold. Hallucinations. But the mirror, tucked away in his backpack, told a different story. His eyes had grown slightly wider, the irises darker, deeper, with a metallic sheen like that of an old coin. And his pupils no longer responded to light. He began to dread the nights, but even more so, the mornings, because each morning he noticed new changes, subtle yet undeniable. His neck seemed to thicken. His muscles, despite receiving no food, didn't waste away. Instead, they appeared denser, as if filled not with strength, but with something else. Scars from falls and cuts vanished without a trace, as if his flesh had ceased to be human and become something self-regenerating, unnaturally vital. He stopped trusting his own hands. Sometimes he caught himself waking with stones clutched in his palm sweat, as if recently unearthed. Once he awoke with dirt under his nails, though he had no memory of leaving the tent. And one day, gazing into the frozen surface of a canister, he realized the face staring back at him no longer felt familiar. Panic gave way to stupor. He began avoiding looking at himself, avoiding touch, because everything he touched seemed marked, and all he felt was a foreign presence. It grew within him, with every hour, with every breath. He wasn't just losing his human form, he was losing the right to call himself human. On the 12th day, the pages of the journal began to thin. Kramer's handwriting grew unsteady, the letters stretching as if his hand trembled or had lost its accustomed grip. The entries shifted in tone. From the reflections of a prospector struggling to survive, they transformed into the confession of a man slowly vanishing from his own body. He no longer posed questions, made no plans for escape, and made no mention of food or cold. All focus centered on it, the entity that no longer merely visited at night, but now seemed to reside within, displacing Kramer himself from his own being. The final entry was brief, scrawled with effort, as if against resistance. The ink smeared, the lines crooked, as if etched through pain with a shaking hand. I tried to leave, buried the gold, closed my eyes, burned my clothes. It didn't let go. It didn't wait for the gold. It waited for me. Now it breathes through me, sees through my eyes. I am not alone. I am it. Let no one come. Please, let no one. The journal ended abruptly, like tracks in snow after a fall. The tent, discovered a year later by hunters, was empty yet not looted, as if it had been abandoned without haste. The hearth was not extinguished but not burning. The boots stood neatly, as if removed and placed before sleep. No human tracks remained. Only the imprints of enormous paws led into the depths of a stone wall, where no cracks or passages existed. And in a corner of the tent, beneath a piece of darkened canvas, lay the journal as if left deliberately, as a warning. In the spring of 1897, when the first thaws allowed the trails north of the Yukon to reopen, a group of hunters tracking a caribou herd stumbled upon a camp hidden deep within the silent valley. The snow there lay thick and undisturbed, yet the site they found seemed untouched by winter. The tent stood askew, as if it had weathered a storm, though neither storms nor winds were known to strike this place. The fire pit was dusted with ash, but within it lay black, charred coals, as if the fire had died out only the day before. A metal mug lay discarded nearby, alongside a rusted spoon. Yet there was no food, no supplies, no person, nothing. Tracks around the site were scarce, almost non-existent. Only a few impressions remained, far too large to belong to a human or even a bear, with claws that seemed carved by a knife and a distinctive sideways shift as if the creature possessed more than one pair of legs. The tracks circled the area before abruptly ending at the base of a massive stone wall, which bore no fissures, entrances, or even cracks. The rock was smooth, as if polished, and cold as ice. Inside the tent, the hunters found only one object that evoked a strange, inexplicable Chilla-worn leather journal. Its pages were damp, smeared with dirt and ash, yet the words remained legible. They rang out like a voice from an abyss eerily clear, penned by a hand that seemed to know it was writing for the last time. One of the hunters, an experienced trapper, immediately closed the book and tossed it back into the tent. He spoke not another word on the journey back, and 2 days later, he departed alone with his rifle in silence, never to be seen again. Thus, Kramer's camp became more than just a site of disappearance. It transformed into a legend, a forbidden mark on old maps and a whisper around campfires. And even decades later, no one returned. The Silent Valley once again fell silent. In the nearby settlements, as word of the hunters' discovery spread, unease rippled faster than the northern wind. Conversations about gold fell silent in the taverns, and even the greediest prospectors suddenly recalled debts that kept them tethered to the south. Among the indigenous people, whose ancestors had avoided the Silent Valley for centuries, a tense silence settled. The elders of the Tanana tribe, living closest to the Forbidden Land, held a night council by the sacred fire for the first time in many winters. One of them, an old man with clouded eyes and a face etched by time, rose and spoke slowly, his words chilling even the most stubborn to their core. He said that the valley had reclaimed its own, that the guardian spirit, an ancient beast slumbering beneath the earth, had awakened due to the grating greed of humankind. He offered no name. There were no words in their language to describe a creature born not of flesh, but of the pain left by those who had dug too deep. According to him, the gold in those parts was neither stone nor metal, but a living fragment of something older than the mountains, and anyone who carried it away took with them a curse. From that day forward, even the boldest hunters passing near the foothills skirted the Silent Valley in a wide arc. No indigenous trail touched its borders. Children no longer listened to fairy tales, they whispered legends, and the night over the valley grew thicker. He arrived unnoticed, aboard the latest northern steamer, lost amid a crowd of fur traders and drunken prospectors. Young, reserved, almost too meticulous for these parts, he introduced himself as Jeremy Faulkner, a geologist from New York, investigating the patterns of lone prospectors' disappearances in Alaska. He wore glasses, spoke deliberately, always kept a notebook at hand, and avoided unnecessary conversation. At the local store, he paid not with gold but with a voucher bearing the seal of a scientific society, immediately arousing suspicion. Yet it soon became clear, Jeremy was no mere paper-pushing scholar. He knew too much, asked questions with too much confidence, and read with too much intent. When Kramer's journal was handed to him, he retreated to a room on the second floor of the tavern and remained there for 3 days, not emerging, filling pages with his own notes, and cross-referencing them with archives brought in his suitcase. He pored over every paragraph, every trembling scribble in the margins. On certain pages, he overlaid transparent sheets with coordinates, jotted down observations about lunar phases, and cross-checked disappearance dates with maps of tectonic shifts. Soon, he began to speak differently. A strange tension crept into his voice. He no longer inquired about the climate or requested tea with lemon. He asked about things the town had long avoided speaking of aloud. About the valley, about the legends, about the tracks in the rock that vanished without explanation. He even sought out an elder from the Tanana tribe and listened in silence as the man told him, "The gold in those lands does not sleep, it waits." Jeremy didn't take notes. He simply nodded. And a week after his arrival, he purchased a map, gathered his gear, and vanished into the morning mist without telling anyone where he was headed, moving in the same direction Kramer had taken a year earlier, toward that very valley, marked as a blank spot on old maps. Jeremy Faulkner did not believe in curses. He believed in geochemistry, in rare compounds, in the influence of natural factors on the human psyche. Studying Kramer's journal, he concluded that the described madness hallucinations, the sensation of being watched, disorientation might not stem from a mythical entity, but from vapors rising from deep earth layers. He drew parallels with phenomena in South American mines, where enclosed cavities accumulated hydrogen sulfide and arsenic vapors, turning ordinary people into paranoids. Perhaps the Silent Valley concealed deposits of rare minerals reacting with underground water, releasing toxic gases, especially in spring when the permafrost thawed. Convinced of his hypothesis's plausibility, he began preparing for an expedition. His actions were precise and methodical, selecting equipment, glass vials, gas analyzers, hermetic masks, and markers to track his route. He even fitted his compass with a calibration needle to account for magnetic anomalies. On a hand-drawn map, he marked suspected geological faults and points where, according to Kramer's notes, the silence had emerged. It was clear to him. Kramer hadn't gone mad, he had been poisoned. The legend of the guardian spirit, the golden monster, and the living tracks was a folkloric overlay born of fear and isolation. And he intended to prove it, not for fame, but for truth. He believed science could always find an explanation, even where others heard growls and saw eyes in the dark. 2 days later, silence once again settled over the Silent Valley. The same silence, thick as cold fog, viscous as frozen earth, hiding something that should not be. No one saw Jeremy enter the valley, but on the morning of the third day, local hunters skirting the edge of the swamps noticed a faint wisp of smoke. They approached and found a camp. Too neat, too fresh as if Jeremy had stepped away briefly and might return any moment. Inside the tent lay a map, instruments, a bottle of water, untouched food, and a carefully packed backpack. Everything was in place except for the geologist himself. But one detail etched itself into memory above all else. On a canvas mat spread at the tent's entrance lay a sheet from a notebook, fresh, still damp with morning dew. Written in Jeremy's hand were his final lines. The handwriting was uneven but legible. The first line read, "The sound returned, but now it's inside me." Below were disjointed descriptions and sketches, including a drawing of a strange paw with claws captioned, "Skin like charred parchment, gold on the teeth. It doesn't breathe, it moves when you don't look." Beneath the sheet, nearly blending with the ground, were pressed tracks. They began right in front of the tent and led toward the rock face the same direction, according to Kramer's notes, where tracks had vanished years ago. The impressions were deeper than a human foot could make and ended abruptly as if the creature had simply passed into the stone, leaving no shadow behind. Even the most seasoned hunter, upon seeing these marks, dared not step closer. Since then, no one in the region has attempted to enter the valley, but on particularly still evenings, when the wind dies down and a shadow stretches toward the fire, someone might hear a faint scratching, or a tremor in the ground, or a rustles if someone were turning pages. The sun sank slowly behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky over the Silent Valley in blood copper hues. The light faded, like an old map losing its edges. The valley lay silent, as if frozen in anticipation of bird songs. No rustle of leaves, only a faint tremor in the air, like the stillness before a storm. The stone at the base of the cliff glistened with frost, and there, where the tree's shadow stretched into an unnatural curve, a print was visible. It was inhuman, an enormous paw with fingers, far too long, twisted, as if torn from some alien anatomy. The surface of the print was smooth, like polished stone, but its edges were sharp, like a fresh crack in granite. The ground around it was compacted, as if something heavy had stood there for a long time. Or often, or perhaps still did. Twilight crept down the slopes, flooding the valley with a thick violet darkness. From the forest, which began like a wall a short distance away, came the first breath. Not wind, not a beast, not an echo. It was a sound no living creature could produce, and yet it didn't belong to the dead. It rose deeply, as if from beneath the roots, from the depths, as if the earth itself were awakening and reminding all of its presence. The valley breathed, and something within it was stirring awake once more.